Hey everyone. So right now we're going to go over chapter 5, which is all about informal fallacies. So chapter 4, we talked about some of the cognitive and perceptual errors that can occur, but really just because of how our brains function. So some of them are not necessarily in our control to avoid, mostly in our control to just be aware of and check ourselves on, right? But what we're getting into here in chapter 5 has more to do with how we are supporting a claim. All right. It's also in chapter 4, we looked at how to evaluate evidence, right? And in that chapter, again, it was really more about some of those perceptual and cognitive errors. But we also need to evaluate evidence in terms of how a claim or how an argument is being supported, the reasoning behind it. And one area that can trip us up quite a bit are informal fallacies. So we start off talking about cults, just a little bit. So according to stateuniversity.com, as of January of 2022, says in a recent poll, 40% of respondents say there are cults that are active on their college campuses. 17% of respondents claim to, at one time or another, have been a member of a cult on campus. Of that 17%, nearly a quarter of them say they felt pressured into joining, while 35% say that they thought the group used mind games to control them. We're going to talk about cults in more depth next week. Not next week, week after, week 5. And sort of how people come to be members of a cult, how it happens. But for right now, let's consider the question of, are young college students or young people in general more susceptible to the recruiting tactics used by cults? And if so, why? So there are several components that can play a role in why younger people may be more susceptible to cults. But one big reason is, of course, a lack of critical thinking skills. We've already kind of determined that those cognitive stages, right? And, you know, if all goes well, we move through those cognitive stages, and by the time, you know, we're a little older, our critical thinking skills are stronger. Sadly, in today's world, that doesn't always happen, and we kind of, some of us we're kind of stuck in either the first stage or the second stage. But certainly, we can see why younger people are more susceptible to these things, because, you know, age and experience and knowledge, all of that, you know, they're just learning critical thinking skills, you know. It's not really their fault. Perhaps they could have started working on those skills before they were out on their own in the world, but you know, it's just age and experience and knowledge. So a lack of assertiveness or dependence on others, a low tolerance for ambiguity, remember, wanting simply right or wrong answers to complex questions, stage 1, dualism, and poor critical thinking skills all make students more likely to succumb to pressure from campus recruiters for cults, or, you know, even if they're not on campus, however they come across them. So considering that some people grow to be passive communicators, and considering how some people never move far past the dualism stage of cognitive development, considering how some people do not ever develop strong enough critical thinking skills as they move through adulthood, is it possible that college freshmen really aren't much different than older individuals who haven't learned strong critical thinking skills yet? Because the book starts off, the chapter 5 in the book, it starts off with this reference to cults and college students, which I did too, but I'm kind of taking it a step further and saying, you know, I'm not so sure that it's just young 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are susceptible to this. In our culture today, we have a hard time moving past stage 1 and stage 2. And if that's the case, with all of those other factors and everything else that we've learned so far, don't you think that it's just as likely that older individuals might be susceptible to cults as well if they have not developed strong critical thinking skills? So along with a lot of the elements that we've already learned about critical thinking, one thing that would help is the ability to recognize fallacious arguments used by cult recruiters to make us less vulnerable to the lure of, destructive cults or any other type of flawed argument. Because as you're going to see, informal fallacies, they are all over the place. All over. So what is a fallacy? Right? So fallacies relate to how an argument is supported, right? So we have an argument. An argument is the process of supporting a claim by providing reasons or evidence for that claim. An argument contains a fallacy when it appears to be initially correct, but upon further examination is found to be faulty or incorrect. In the case of formal fallacies, it is the form of the argument itself that is invalid. And we're going to talk more about that next week. But an informal fallacy, it's mistaken reasoning that occurs when an argument is psychologically or emotionally persuasive, but logically incorrect. And we'd all love to think that, we would recognize this, that we would see, notice the absence of logic. We would notice how the person or group making the claim is trying to be psychologically or emotionally persuasive. But it's not always easy to tell. It's not always apparent. And we can overlook those things for a variety of reasons. So we're going to be looking at 3 different groups of informal fallacies. Fallacies of ambiguity, fallacies of relevance, and fallacies of unwarranted assumptions. Let's look first at fallacies of ambiguity. Arguments that contain ambiguous words or phrases, sloppy grammatical structure, or confusion between 2 closely related concepts can lead to fallacies of ambiguity. People with poor language and communication skills are more likely to use or fall for these types of fallacies. And there are 5 types of fallacies of ambiguity. There's equivocation, amphibole, fallacy of accent, fallacy of division, and fallacy of composition. We're going to take a quick look at each one of those. So first we have equivocation. First type of fallacy of ambiguity. Equivocation occurs when there is a key term in an argument that is ambiguous, when it has more than one meaning. We have a few examples here. So in our first example, Carl says, terminally ill patients have a right to decide how and when they want to die. And Juan says, that's not true. There is no right to euthanasia in US law. So we have an ambiguous word there, the word right. And it can be used in different contexts. So Carl is saying it's just a basic human right, that maybe it should be a law, right? We have a right. And Juan is thinking more of actual legal laws, right? And so the idea of a right can be different depending on the context. It's an ambiguous word. Another example says 2-year-old Katie is very tall. Her father, on the other hand, is not tall, but about average in height. Therefore, Katie is taller than her father. Well, Paul You think it would mean just one thing, but it is different in different contexts. Saying that 2-year-old Katie is very tall, we probably mean she's tall for a 2-year-old, right? It's not saying that she's taller than her father. Or things like Tiger Woods is a good golfer, therefore Tiger Woods is a good husband. The word good is so ambiguous. It can mean so many different things. You always want to use specific word choices when possible, but as we learned, even some specific word choices can still be ambiguous because we use them in different contexts. You always have to make sure that everyone is on the same page when there is a word or phrase, or maybe numerous words or phrases being used frequently in an argument, that kind of like the heart of the argument. You have to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of what you mean. Then we have amphiboly. This is when there's a grammatical mistake in the sentence of the argument, the way it's written or spoken. So we have, Terri Schiavo's mother and her husband are on opposite sides of the battle over her life. Are we talking about Terri's mother and father, or are we talking about Terri's mother and Terri's husband? Because Terri Schiavo's mother and her husband. Is it her husband? Is it Terri's husband or the mother's husband? Right? This is where misplaced modifiers can really get us into trouble. The slogan for Clinique's fragrance, happy. Wear it and be happy. Does the word and imply a causal relationship? Like if you wear it, it will cause you to be happy? Or are they like wear it, be happy? Like this is, we want you to wear it, we want you to be happy. Or is it wearing it will make you happy? Not exactly structured in a way that makes it clear. Then we have fallacies of accent. This is when an argument's meaning changes depending on which words or phrases are emphasized. So we have here an example. Mom says, "Didn't I say don't play with matches?" And the daughter says, "But I wasn't playing with matches. I was using them to burn the neighbor's shed." Right? So Mom was emphasizing matches. Don't play with matches. The daughter was emphasizing the word play. It wasn't playing. Or according to our school newspaper, the administration is going to crack down on off-campus drinking. So we're emphasizing off-campus drinking. I guess that means on-campus drinking is acceptable. Not quite. We have fallacies of division. So this occurs when we make an erroneous inference or an incorrect inference from the characteristics of an entire set or group, and we apply those characteristics to a specific member of the group, right? So an example, men are taller than women. Whole group, men. Danny DeVito is a man, one specific member of that group. Therefore, Danny DeVito is taller than the average woman. We know Danny DeVito is on the shorter side. He is not taller than the average woman. We are applying the rules, the characteristics of the group to a single member of the group, and it doesn't work. Or I hear that Canadians are really nice people. Therefore, Derek, who is from Saskatchewan, must be really nice. We have no idea if Derek's nice because he's from Canada. Then we have the opposite, the fallacy of composition. That occurs when we look at the characteristic of one thing and apply it to the group, right? So the rooms in the hotel are small. Therefore, the hotel must be small. So one single unit, right? Applying it to the whole. We do fallacies of division and composition quite a bit. Then we have fallacies of relevance. So just as you would think, it is when one or more of the premises is logically irrelevant or unrelated to the conclusion. You'd think these would be easy to spot, but we fall for them a lot. But you'd like to think, well, if something is irrelevant, why would we put faith in that argument? And we do all the time. And because psychologically, they seem to be relevant, but they're not. So fallacies of relevance include the ad hominem, appeals to force, appeals to pity, popular appeals, appeals to ignorance, hasty generalizations, straw man, and red herrings. You're going to recognize a lot of them. So our first fallacy of relevance is the ad hominem, which is the personal attack. So this is when we disagree with someone else and we attack them personally instead of presenting a valid counter argument. So we see the ad hominem fallacy in politics, media, all over the place, but we use them in everyday life too. Got a couple examples here. You know, it says, meanwhile, in the Montana state governor's race, she says, and because of that, I'm for raising the minimum wage in our state. And our dark guy over here says, she's for raising minimum wage, but isn't even smart enough to run a business. He's attacking her personally, instead of coming up with a valid counter argument as to why the minimum wage shouldn't be raised. They're just attacking her character. Or, you know, our two lovely people down here with two lovely birds. We share many genetic characteristics with ducks because we have evolved from a common ancestor. And the other one says, you're closed-minded and stupid and you eat corn. You don't know anything. We do this a lot. And we see it done a lot. Ad hominem attacks they are so prevalent in our culture. They're everywhere. But it is a fallacy of relevance because what the second person is saying, the attack, bears no relevance to the claim the first person made. It's not actually a counter argument. One second here. All right. Anyway, ad hominems all over the place. Our next fallacy of relevance is the appeal to force, also known as scare tactics. This is pretty common too. So an appeal to force fallacy occurs when we use or threaten to use force in an attempt to get others to back down or accept our conclusion. And it doesn't have to be like a visible threat or a physical threat. It can be psychological or legal. So we have a couple of examples here. This image right here, stop climate change before it changes you. Wow. I mean, that's a scare tactic. An old World War II propaganda poster here. We have these three kids, all American kiddos, playing in the yard, and there's this shadow of a swastika here. It says, don't let that shadow touch them. Buy war bonds. Like, oh, you got to buy these war bonds to help us pay for the war effort, or your kids are going to be speaking German. Or Elizabeth Smith doesn't understand foreign policy. If you elect her as president, we will be attacked by terrorists, paid for by the campaign to elect Dr. Fallacy. And then our hero comes in and says, viewer, don't let Dr. Fallacy scare you into voting for him. This political ad is an appeal to fear fallacy. Again, these are everywhere. Fear, oh my goodness. It's out there more than physical and legal threat are. It's a psychological fear is the most commonly used appeal to force fallacy. Then we have our appeal to pity. So this occurs when we try to evoke feelings of pity, right? This pathos, when it is irrelevant to the conclusion. Now, not all appeals to pity are fallacy, because there are times when a person's plight, like what they're going through, does call for a sympathetic response. But if the appeal to pity is being used to persuade you to convince you, then it's a fallacy. I can look at someone's situation and think, we'll take this first example here. The student says, I really deserve an A on this paper, professor. Not only did I study during my grandmother's funeral, I also passed up the heart transplant surgery, even though that was the first matching donor in 3 years. They're using that appeal. They are trying to appeal to my empathy, they're using an appeal of pity to get what they want. That is a fallacy. Now, as an instructor, if I know a student is going through something tough, right, and I reach out to them and I say, hey, I know, you've been really sick this week. You can, have a few extra days to turn in an assignment. That's not a fallacy. That's not, because the student wasn't trying to convince me. I wasn't being persuaded, but I did have a sympathetic response and therefore took action. But that's on me, right? And it was probably the right thing to do. It's the nice thing to do, right? But when it's being used to purposefully persuade you, then it's a fallacy. Because it's a psychological tactic. Then we have popular appeal, kind of the bandwagon. You might hear it referred to as a bandwagon appeal. This is when we appeal to popular opinion to gain support for our conclusion. Either the bandwagon approach or the snob approach, right? So like everyone is totally going to get the new smartphone when it comes out this weekend. Why aren't you? And she says, hello, money. And the other girl says, oh, but you should get it. And someone off to the side is like, wait, she just said she doesn't have the money, but it's a popular appeal. Everyone else is doing it. Why aren't you? Right? So that's used quite a bit look at advertising. All of these are used in advertising to some extent. But advertising in politics is where you're going to see all of these the most all the time. But we do this. Popular appeal, man. Our next fallacy of relevance is the appeal to ignorance. Now, this is not appealing to someone's ignorance. What it means is when we try to argue that something is true just because no one else has proven it to be false. Now, if no one's proven it to be false, we do need to keep an open mind, but that is not solid evidence to say that it is true. So our examples here, there is no evidence disproving the existence of aliens. Therefore, aliens exist. Now, if it were to say, therefore, aliens might exist, then we really no longer have a fallacy. That's just keeping an open mind, right? Yeah, okay, sure. It hasn't been disproved, so we cannot say with certainty either way. So therefore, aliens might exist, right? Or I've never seen Ireland, so it doesn't exist. Well, that one's just silly. But it's, again, if I haven't seen it, if I haven't experienced it, then it must not be real. This happens a lot when people, especially on social media, share an experience or make a statement, and someone else will comment and say, well, that's never happened to me, so I think you're full of crap. Just because it's never happened to you is not proof that it never happens, right? That happens. That's a pretty popular one. Appeal to ignorance sneaks in like that in social conversations a lot. I've seen it happen quite a bit. Our next fallacy of relevance is the hasty generalization. This is kind of it's very similar to stereotyping in a way, but it's on a bigger scale, actually. So it's when we generalize from a sample that is too small or biased, right? It's like the examples here. The one lady here, did you hear about the teenagers who vandalized the park downtown? And the other lady says, no. And then our menacing guy over here says, I did. Teenagers are so irresponsible and destructive. You can see it's kind of like a stereotype, but it's generalizing. It is very similar to stereotyping, but it's not because of the same thing. It's not caused by the same things as stereotyping. Our next fallacy of relevance is the straw man. This occurs when a person distorts or misrepresents the opponent's argument so that it is easier to knock it down or refute. And this first example, it happens a lot. So, guy said, you want to go get hamburgers? Second guy, or scarecrow guy, says, can we get pizza instead? The first guy says, what? So you're saying we should only ever eat pizza? That we should just burn down all the hamburger stores? Scarecrow guy's like, that's a very inaccurate and unfair representation of what I said. This is, I don't know if you guys have seen the meme on social media where someone says, I really love pineapple. I really love pineapple. And then someone will come back and say, what? Well, what about bananas and oranges and apples? Like you can't just, you're so close-minded, and you're exclusionary, and just all these awful things that they're saying about the first person who all they said was just they like pineapple. They said it had nothing to do with any other fruit, right? But the other people create a straw man argument. It's like, let me twist this situation to make it seem like you made a statement that I can argue with. But there was no argumentative statement made in the first place, right? Want to go get hamburgers? Could we get pizza instead? But how many times do we see it turn into this kind of silliness right there? All right? Or this is a more relevant, probably a more relevant example here. The second example, pollution from humans contributes to climate change because, and then our dark, sinister guy cuts them off. So you think humans are directly responsible for extreme weather like hurricanes and have caused droughts in the Southwest US? If that's the case, maybe we just need to go to the Southwest and perform a rain dance. It's creating an argument where one did not exist by twisting and distorting what the original person stated. This happens in politics a lot. It happens on social media a lot. The red herring, this is a distraction, right? So red herring occurs when a person tries to sidetrack an argument by going off on a tangent and bringing up a different issue. Totally unrelated, right? So we have person one. Did your foundation accept money from foreign entities that support terror organizations? Very specific question, right? Person two says, my foundation has done a lot of good for the world, including things like protecting women's rights and providing healthcare to third world countries. Completely sidetracked that question. Totally just. Or down here in our second example, we have someone who's thinking about, the environment, saving the environment. And the second person who's holding up the red herring says, we can't worry about the environment. We're in the middle of a war. Totally using the war as a distraction because we don't want to talk about the environment. All right. Then we also have fallacies involving unwarranted assumptions. So this occurs when an argument includes an assumption that is not supported by the evidence, and it weakens the argument. So we have things, Examples of unwarranted assumptions: begging the question, inappropriate appeal to authority, a loaded question, a false dilemma, questionable cause, slippery slope, and naturalistic fallacy. So, begging the question. This is when an argument's conclusion is simply a rewording of its premise, also known as circular logic or circular reasoning. All right, so here's our example. Susie says, paranormal activity exists because I have experienced things that can only be described as paranormal activity. That's not really proof. That is not real. You're not really supporting your claim. You're just, it's rewording the claim. Or, can you explain what you mean when you say Aladdin is your hero? Of course. I mean, he acts heroically. Which means what to you? That he's a hero? Right? There's no actual evidence given. Or the really popular one that came from former President Bush. I'm not trying to make fun of him or anything at all. It's just a really good example. And sure, we could find a million others out there from former presidents and politicians. But he made a statement in the media at one point that said something to the effect of low voter turnout is the result of fewer people going to the polls. So it sounds like he's about to give a reason why there was low voter turnout. But low voter turnout and fewer people going to the polls is the same thing. It's just worded differently. So there's no real proof given to support the claim. Then we have our next fallacy involving unwarranted assumptions, the inappropriate appeal to authority. Obviously, this is going to be all over the place in advertising, right? So this is when we look to an authority figure, but in a field that is completely unrelated to the topic we're discussing, right? So we have the cigarette ad, Viceroy's filter the smoke. Ask your dentist. What does a dentist have to, why would we be asking a dentist what cigarettes we should smoke? Or why would we be listening to what Oprah says about when we should eat or when we shouldn't eat? Any celebrity being used to endorse a product is likely an inappropriate appeal to authority. I'm not going to say every single time, because it is entirely possible that a celebrity might actually know about the product, might actually be involved in the production of the product, might actually use the product. It's not outside the realm of possibility. But let's face it, a lot of times celebrities simply get paid to endorse a product, and therefore they endorse it and get paid. They know nothing about it. They are not experts on it. But yet it appeals to us. Right? We also have what's called a loaded question. This is when we ask a question, but the question is worded in a way that makes it seem like we have already answered a previous question, but we didn't. So our example here, have you stopped cheating on tests? It's a loaded question, because if I say, well, yeah, I stopped cheating on tests, that implies that I was cheating on tests in the past, and now I've stopped. But if I say, no, I haven't stopped cheating on tests, that makes it sound like I'm still cheating. Now, in normal everyday conversation, we would have an opportunity to sort of, change and clarify. Have you stopped cheating on tests? What do you mean? I never started cheating on tests, right? We could do that. But loaded questions are often used in surveys and different types of polling applications. So keep that in mind. Like, look, are there loaded questions on here? Right? Happens very common in surveys and polls. Then we have our false dilemma fallacy. This type of fallacy takes a very complex issue and reduces it down to an either or choice. The argument is worded and supported in a way that makes it seem like it's black or white, when really there could be 1,000 shades of gray in between. This type of fallacy is what is used to polarize people on issues and get them to forget about or ignore the common ground, or get them to ignore other possible solutions. So our examples here, we have our candidate over here who says, I stand against going to war. And then our dark, sinister guy said, since you are against war, you must be against our troops. Against our troops? Is she really? No, it's way more complex than that. Or we must find home for 10,000 Syrian Muslim refugees. Yet here's a picture of one of 50,000 homeless American veterans. Like, this happens a lot in politics and social media again. Like, we reduce things to this very simplistic state when it is not simple at all. It's very complex, and very rarely do we only have two choices or two explanations or two possible solutions. There's usually many, but we polarize it using the false dilemma fallacy, and it works so well. We also have questionable cause. This is also sometimes known to as post hoc or post hoc ergo propter hoc. And it's basically when we assume that one thing is the cause of another. We haven't done enough research. We do not have sufficient evidence to prove that one thing actually causes another, but we go with it anyway. So we have our examples here. Looks like everyone who died drank water. So drinking water must be killing people. We know that drinking water is not the cause of these people dying. And it's very obvious that this is a faulty causal relationship when we have an example like this that is just ludicrous. But that's just an example being used that is easily accessible so that you can see how silly the causal relationship is. But questionable cause, it is abundant. It is, oh man. Again, politics, media, social media. We like to find cause and effect relationships. We want to know the reasons why something happened. And sometimes we don't really care what the evidence shows. And we don't bother to find out if there's any relationship whatsoever, or if it's their, correlation instead of causation. We just go with one thing causes the next. We run into this fallacy a lot. Oh, slippery slope. This one is quite abundant as well. So this fallacy occurs when we say, if we allow one thing to happen, then anything else like that, even extreme ones, will soon be permissible. Like, it's almost like give a mouse a cookie. like this chain of events that happens and it all snowballs, right? Never sing in the shower. Singing leads to dancing. Dancing leads to slipping, and slipping leads to paramedics seeing you naked. So remember, don't sing, right? Or example at the top. And to conclude, I leave you with this. If we enact any kind of gun control laws, the next thing you know, we won't be allowed to defend ourselves against terrorist attacks. And when that happens, terrorists will take over our country. Therefore, gun control laws will cause us to lose our country to terrorists. Good point. That doesn't seem right to me. Right? Slippery slope. Right? If we let one thing happen, we give an inch, they'll take a mile. And I'm not going to say that that never happens, but there's no proof. There's no way to say that that's actually accurate. It's a fallacy to support an argument with that reason. I don't think that it's unreasonable to be concerned or to raise questions, right? About, like, what will the effects be, right? But that's valid. It's when we use this type of reasoning to support an argument. Like, that's our proof. Our proof is that if we let A happen, then B all the way down to Z is going to happen. That's not support. That's not evidence, right? Then we have our naturalistic fallacy, which is the assumption that anything that is natural is good or morally acceptable, and that anything that is unnatural is bad or morally unacceptable. I like this example down here because I think that this is often where we fall prey to the naturalistic fallacy, is with food and drinks. So we have Nesquik here, all natural, cocoa from West Africa with tropical raw cane sugar, 100% natural ingredients. Okay, well, let's assume that it is natural. Does that automatically mean it's good for us? No, not at all. Right? So those are our different types of informal fallacies. Now let's take a quick look at some strategies for avoiding these informal fallacies, because I hope as we've gone through them, you have recognized most of them. And you could probably think back in the last 24 hours of your life and be like, oh, wow, I have personally witnessed many of these just in the last 24 hours. It's crazy. How do we avoid them, or how do we fight against them, right? Well, step one, know yourself and the fallacies that you are most susceptible to. Think back through all of those informal fallacies. Which ones have you experienced and have sort of taken you in, that you've kind of fallen for, right? Which ones are you most likely to use in an argument? If you're trying to put forth your point of view, are you susceptible to using any of these informal fallacies? Step two, build your self-confidence and your self-esteem. It'll make you less likely to give in to peer pressure. It's gonna, especially so that, popular appeal, that bandwagon appeal. People who are confident are less likely to back down when others use a fallacy on them, or to become defensive and start using fallacies themselves, right? So build your self-confidence and your self-esteem. Doing good research and having a sound knowledge base for whatever topic you're discussing helps with self-confidence as well, right? Cultivate good listening skills. Be respectful when other people are expressing their views, even if you disagree with them. Don't be thinking of how you're going to respond. Truly listen to what they're saying. After they have said it, repeat it back to them to ensure that you have fully understood them. Look for common ground. If you notice a fallacy in their argument, politely point it out, respectfully point it out. And if the argument appears to be weak, don't, just walk away and gloat that your argument was stronger. Ask the person if they have better support, if there's more evidence, right? See what they have, see if there's more to offer. Maybe they thought that was enough, or maybe, whatever the case may be. But again, remember, when we're talking about using our critical thinking skills, it's not about persuading people and winning an argument, right? It is about collaboratively coming to the truth as much as possible. Step 4, avoid ambiguous, vague terms and faulty grammar. You got to have good communication and writing skills. You have to clearly define your terms and expect the same from others. Don't be afraid to ask questions if they haven't been clear and articulate. If they have used ambiguous words or phrases, if they have faulty grammar, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't ask for clarification. Step 5, avoid confusing the soundness of an argument with the character or circumstances of the person making the argument. Focus on the argument, because this could go either way. You have someone who you really don't like, you don't trust, you've had issues with, whatever the case may be, and they are explaining a point of view to you. Your first instinct might be to disregard it immediately because of the person stating it. But you can't. Still got to listen. Or what if it's a person that you really like, that you get along with really well? Maybe someone you admire, maybe someone you love and care about. You can't just assume that what's coming out of their mouth is a well-supported claim. You have to look at the argument, not the person giving it. Resist the temptation to counterattack. If the other person attacks your character, they use an ad hominem fallacy. Don't stoop to their level. All right? What did Michelle Obama say? When they go low, we go high. Right? The idea is that, we have this this idea in our culture that it's okay to fight back if the other person throws the first blow, right? Or that it's okay to start using fallacies because the other person did. It's just, that's immature thinking, right? Step 6, know your research, know your topic, right? You got to do your research first. Knowing your subject makes it less likely that you will commit a fallacy just because you're unable to defend yourself and defend your position. But that means, again, doing research when we're talking about cultivating critical thinking skills, it's all the research, not just that which supports the point of view you already possess. It's doing all the research and keeping an open mind. Step 7, adopt the skeptical default position. Remain skeptical about your own position and open to the possibility that you are mistaken, and maybe you don't have all the evidence, maybe you don't have the whole truth, right? Remain skeptical about other people's claims as well. Find the balance between keeping an open mind, but also expecting the other person to provide sound reasoning, credible evidence, and fallacy-free explanation, right? So don't assume that you can't change your views. Keep an open mind, but expect well-supported arguments from other people as well, right? Watch your body language and try to avoid inflammatory actions, because fallacies don't need to be written or spoken. A personal attack, an appeal to force, that can be conveyed through body language, rolling your eyes, walking away, we staring at someone if it's a bit of a forceful appeal, right, or a scare tactic. our body language can add to the argument as well. Step 9, don't be set on winning. Like I've already said, it's not about who's right or wrong, not about winning the argument. It's about getting to the truth or coming up with a solution or coming up with a compromise, right? If your purpose is to win, then you're more likely to rely on fallacies and rhetoric instead of a well-reasoned, well-supported claim. It's not, the goal is not to persuade other people or to win. It's to achieve a goal or solve a problem. And you need to do that in a cooperative way. So think about how all of those informal fallacies show up all around us, right? Think about how they show up in the media, how they show up in politics, how they show up on social media, how they show up in the workplace, how they show up in your personal life, right? And how easy it is to let them deter us, you know, how easy it is to sort of fall victim to them. And keep in mind that, you know, you have to be able to identify these fallacies in yourself and in others. And, you know, use those strategies because you don't want fallacies to have a place at the table. They don't belong there. Our critical thinking issue this week is perspectives on gun control. So you will need to read that at the end of chapter 5, and that is part of your critical thinking issue assignment for this week. But think about how some of those informal fallacies find their way into the national debate of gun control. Okay. All right, so that is it for chapter 5. If you have questions, I know I went through them kind of quickly, but I don't know that there's a great need to spend a lot of time on these informal fallacies. I think once you have a name to it and you have an example of it, then it's like, oh, yeah, I see that a lot. But don't hesitate to reach out. If there were any of them where you're like, you know, not quite sure I fully understand that type of informal fallacy, reach out and I will help clarify. The book might also clear it up for you, but you know, certainly consider each of them and think about how common they are and how much we are inundated with informal fallacies in our culture. If you have questions, reach out. Otherwise, you are free to go ahead and move on.